So the Edward H. Hume Memorial Lecture is in honor of Dr. Hume, and it's made possible by generosity of his family and many friends. And for many years, actually, the Hume family members are here with us every year. And Dr. Hume devoted much of his long and vigorous life to working in China and elsewhere in the cause of healthcare and medical training. He served as president of the College of Yale in China from 1923 to 1927. He returned to the U.S., was then recalled to China in 1934 to work for several years in liaison with the Chinese National Health Administration. So from 1937 to his retirement, Dr. Hume directed a Christian Medical Council for overseas work in New York and wrote a number of books about his medical work on China. And shortly after his death in 1957, funds from the colleagues, friends, and family helped us establish this fund, and which is why we've been able to invite the most eminent scholars from East Asia, from John Fairbank in 1960-61 to Frederick Mote, and now to our speaker, Tom Christensen from Columbia, recently Columbia. So in any case, I will hand the floor over to Peter.
Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce my former colleague at MIT, Tom Christensen, to give this lecture. He's done an amazing number of things, both in academia and also working for the U.S. government in the State Department. He's got his BA in history, which I'm proud to say, we could almost claim him, from Haverford College, an MA in International Relations from University of Pennsylvania, and a PhD in political science from Columbia University in 1993. Later, he taught at MIT, where we were colleagues together for about 5 years in the 1990s. Then he moved to Princeton and has been there until this year. And now he's moved to Columbia, where he's professor of public and international affairs and director of the China in the World program at Columbia. And he's had a tremendous long CV with many, many articles and several books. He's written both for the professional field of security studies and political science. He's written what I think classify as even history analysis. And he's written articles for foreign affairs and the popular press and many other things. And his most recent book, The China Challenge, I think everybody should read, really outlines the past 30 years or so of foreign policy challenges and relations between the U.S. and China in a very, very insightful way. I just mentioned a few things. First, actually, his first article was called Threats, Assurances, and the Last Chance for Peace, The Lessons of Mao's Korea War Telegrams in the Journal of International Security. That's the first piece of Tom's work I read, and I was very impressed by it. Again, he gets a historian's gold star because new telegrams that Mao had issued in the Kimoimatsu crisis had been revealed, and he used the new sources from this kind of information to create a new interpretation of what Mao was up to in the 1950s. And then Useful Adversaries, Grand Strategy, Domestic Mobilization, and Sino-American Conflict, 1947 to 1958, is again a kind of historical view of U.S.-China relations in this 40s, 50s era, as well as the questions of grand strategies of China and the U.S. and how they interacted in this period. Many, many articles ensued after that, but his next book, at least the next one I read, I can't keep up with all of Tom's writing, was Worse Than a Monolith, Alliance Politics and Coercive Diplomacy in Asia. This, again, is a brilliant combination of political science theory and historical analysis, looking at the fact that the U.S. had allies during the Cold War in East Asia, and China, of course, had its ally for a while, Russia, in the Cold War in East Asia. But the fact of having alliances probably made the Cold War worse. That the fact that the allies had different intentions from the superior partners tended to heighten conflicts rather than make them easier to solve. And then finally, his most recent book, The China Challenge, as I said, is based both on his personal experience in the State Department when he was involved in negotiations, as well as a very insightful overview of U.S. China relations during the past several decades. And I can't resist reading one little passage here, which shows how incredibly funny Tom can be. Books like this are not usually very humorous, but he has a kind of way of putting in little dry pieces of humor that really, I think, add a lot to the insight. He was involved in the rounds of talks, the six-party talks with North Korea and China and others in 2006 and 2007. He was sitting across the table from some very tough negotiators from China and North Korea, and this is his short comment on his impression of the North Korean regime. The North Korean regime was, at its core, much more of a crime syndicate than a legitimate nation state. The fact that Pyongyang's entourage included one sharply dressed and smooth-talking consigliere only heightened my image of the North Korean regime as a mob. I had worked in the construction industry in New York City in the 1980s and had seen such characters before. So now I give you Tom Christensen to tell you what he thinks in his own words.
Thanks so much, Peter, and thanks to Jing for having me, and thanks to Elise for all of her help. Hurting academics is never easy, and I appreciate all your administrative support. It's a great honor to be here to speak for the Hume at the Hume Lecture here at Yale University. And I know your speakers always say that it's a great honor to speak at a university like Yale. For me, it's a particular honor because I know your very high standards, having failed to gain admission here on 3 separate occasions. And my brother went here, so you can imagine the problems that creates in the home front. It's a great pleasure. I'm going to talk about the rise of China and national security challenges for the United States and its friends and allies in Asia. I'll speak for about 35 or 40 minutes, and I'm hoping that we'll have a lot of time for Q&A. I really see 2 major challenges attendant to China's rise in Asia. And one of those challenges is how to dissuade China from using force or coercion to settle the many sovereignty disputes it has in its periphery. And I will move to a map, and we'll talk about those sovereignty disputes in a moment. I think this challenge is often missed by people who see some other challenges, and these challenges I don't think are very realistic. And one is that they believe China is trying to drive the United States entirely out of the East Asian region. And the other is that China is going to become a global superpower, peer competitor rival of the United States in the vein of the Soviet Union. And I see little persistent evidence for either of these alternative theories. First, I don't see a lot of evidence that China has been adopting a persistent strategy of driving the United States out of East Asia. If it tried to do that, that would be a very dangerous, conflict-ridden strategy. So I believe that this is an imagined strategy, but it has not yet manifested itself. The second is I simply don't believe China will be strong enough for decades to be a peer competitor, global rival of the United States. And we can talk about that in the Q&A, why I don't believe China will be as powerful as the United States is around the world for a very long time. So that one you can just remove from physical capability. And the first one about driving the U.S. out, I think you can remove because there's been no evidence of persistent intention to drive the United States out. Unfortunately, the good news ends there. China doesn't need to be a global peer competitor of the United States to pose real security challenges to U.S. national security interests, and obviously even greater national security interests to U.S. friends and allies in the East Asia region. The region is very important to the United States. China has long been capable of destabilizing that region, and China is more capable today, and it gets more capable every day, of destabilizing the region of East Asia in ways that would gravely impact U.S. national security interests and obviously, again, the interests of our allies and friends in the region. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge I also think is often missed, and that is we need persistent cooperation from China. The United States and like-minded states around the world need persistent cooperation from China to handle some of the global security challenges that we face, in particular nuclear non-proliferation in countries like North Korea and Iran. And China's economic footprint in these areas is so great that it is impossible to put pressure on these states without China's cooperation. And if China obstructs those international efforts to pressure those states, those efforts are likely to fail. And they're even likely to fail if China does not actively contribute, because China's economic footprint in those places is so great, and those states are able to rely almost solely on the relationship with China in times of dire straits for those states. That would be Iran and North Korea in particular. In addition, China has great institutional power in international institutions of all sorts, especially the UN Security Council, where it has a veto, and that also requires the United States to engage China on these international security issues if the United States wants to try to solve them short of the use of force. And that's something that the United States does prefer to do in most instances. So China's role in these issues is always very important. Okay, so let's look at the security issue number one, which is the need to dissuade China, deter China from trying to settle its many sovereignty disputes in its periphery through the use of force or through the threat of the use of force in ways that would destabilize East Asia. And East Asia, particularly in a globalized world, is extremely important to the security of everybody. So China has disputes with several of its neighbors. I will roam out. I'll start in the north. Here in the area that the Chinese call the Diaoyu Islands and the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands, there is a dispute between Japan and China, Japan being the United States' most powerful and important ally, arguably, in Northeast Asia. There's a second type of dispute in Taiwan. It's a little bit different. It's about what the sovereign meaning of Taiwan is in relation to mainland China. It's not the same kind of dispute as the one above it in the Diaoyu-Senkaku dispute. And it's different from the third dispute that I'll talk about, which is the South China Sea. And China's claim is something like this, the 9-dash line. And it has disputes with Vietnam, with Malaysia, with Brunei, with the Philippines, and not really a dispute with Taiwan because Taiwan's traditional claim goes back to before the founding of the People's Republic of China, and it is pretty much the same claim as the PRC's claim. So there's an overlapping claim with Taiwan. So if we look at the pictures of these things, I'll just show you quickly. Here is the Diaoyu-Senkaku dispute. We can return to this if you want to talk about it in the Q&A. And then if you look at the mess that is the South China Sea, you can see China has the most expansive claims in the South China Sea, but they're not alone in having expansive claims. If you look at, for example, the Vietnamese claim, how far that comes off of Vietnam, and how much it overlaps with the Malaysian claims and the Filipino claims. So it's not just China, but it's China's the most expansive in its claims in the South China Sea. Go back to that one. That's always the best one. Okay. So China, the United States and the United States partners, China's neighbors, need to convince China that those sovereignty disputes should not be handled through the use of force or coercion in order to maintain the peace and stability of a region that is very important to the United States. This has become more difficult over time. There's been a very fast-paced growth in the Chinese economy, as you know, going back to 1978 in the reform period launched by Deng Xiaoping in late 1978. But there's been an even faster growth in China's military modernization, especially since 1999. China's military has grown very quickly in its capabilities and its budgets in ways that pose new challenges to the East Asian stability that I'm trying to preserve in this discussion. So let's look at China's traditional military and what changed. China's traditional military was a military that had two purposes, both related to the same core security interests. And I want you to focus on that as we move forward in the discussion. Its two purposes were to counter the domestic and international foes of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, is not a national military. It is a party military. That's not just a foreigner's analysis. That's something that President Xi Jinping insists on pretty much every couple of weeks. He says something to the military to say, remember, you are a party military. We don't have a national military. So because that was the main purpose of the Chinese Communist Party's military wing, the PLA, they didn't require a lot of power projection capabilities for decades. So they had a large land army designed to put down domestic foes and to drown in a sea of militarized people anybody who would invade China. In addition, they had a relatively rudimentary nuclear force. If public reports are accurate, just a couple of dozen intercontinental ballistic missiles, liquid fuels, most likely with the warheads not mated to the missile, so very slow in response. Not something that could take out the nuclear arsenals of the superpowers, but something that would make the nuclear superpowers have to think twice about attacking China with nuclear weapons, a relatively rudimentary force. So that was China's military for a very long time, into the 1990s for the most part. But more recently, China has developed the ability to project power off of its coast into these disputed areas. And China is rubbing up against its neighbors in new ways, the way that rising powers always do. Ooh, just forget everything in the first part. China is projecting power and rubbing against its neighbors in new ways, as all rising powers do. And lest I seem to be making a kind of cultural argument saying that China is somehow more destabilizing than other rising powers, I say this, that in 2000 I published an article with my colleague at Columbia, Dick Betts, in which we argued that if China's rise in its region is as destabilizing as America's rise in its own region in the late 19th century, we're all in for big trouble. Because the United States, as you know, got into a totally unnecessary war with Spain because of domestic jingoism and nationalism, ended up in a large counterinsurgency war in the Philippines, all unnecessary and all highly destabilizing. So we can only hope that China does better than the United States. I'm not picking on China, but this is what happens when countries rise in their region. They rub up against their neighbors in new ways. And the capabilities, and I'll list some of them because I think they are important to understand, the capabilities that China has developed to project that power include the following. They are asymmetric capabilities. Asymmetric in the sense that they're not closing the gap with the US military power overall in a significant way, but what they're doing is posing risks to forward deployed US forces and particularly to US allies in East Asia if they were to get involved in a conflict with China, particularly in a conflict with China on issues that China believes it cares about more than the United States and perhaps some of those neighbors. Okay, so the first type of capability that I'll talk about are accurate, conventionally tipped, solid fuel ballistic missiles. This is a real innovation for the Chinese military. There really was no other military that ever created such a thing in the past in any kind of quantity. And what this does is it puts at risk forward deployed US bases. And if public reports are accurate, the DoD's public reports are accurate, China has developed and innovated an anti-ship ballistic missile that can be fired from the mainland of China and hit moving targets at sea, which reduces one of America's traditional great advantages of power projection far from home, which is naval aviation, aircraft carriers. If you can't send aircraft carriers safely toward a target, you now have reduced power projection capability unless you're willing to pay very high costs. And as you may know, on one aircraft carrier, there are 5,000 US personnel. So that's a big target in terms of cost. A second capability are submarines. China has invested in diesel-electric submarines that it has acquired from Russia, the former Soviet Union. It has reverse engineered some of these. It has developed them so that they're relatively quiet and can stay submerged for a long time. And those submarines are capable of launching sophisticated torpedoes, laying sophisticated sea mines, and most recently launching cruise missiles from below the surface of the water in ways that, again, don't match the US military, but put at risk a superior US military if it were deployed in the region around China. Cruise missiles that are very sophisticated are also capable of being launched from the air and also from the surface of the sea. Advanced aircraft, fourth generation aircraft in relatively large numbers that can fly off the Chinese coast and put at risk places like Taiwan, the Japanese forces around the Senkaku Islands, and somewhat into the South China Sea, a little bit less so into the South China Sea. But what's also often missed in these discussions is China has sophisticated air defenses that can set a kind of umbrella off the Chinese coast and make it very difficult for superior militaries like the US Air Force to project power without relatively high costs in the vicinity of China. Another capability is anti-satellite weapons. One of the great advantages of the US military in recent decades has been the ability to control and see enemy and friendly forces on the battlefield in real time. It's called C4ISR in military speech. So a lot of that capability that the United States has, that elegant capability, is reliant on satellites. And China has demonstrated its ability to strike satellites from the surface of the Earth with anti-satellite weapons, and therefore potentially undercuts some of that superiority that the United States has. We all hear about cyber as a potential tool in the military sphere. I take it extremely seriously. All I can say about cyber as somebody who still has government clearances is that the more you know about cyber, the less you can say about cyber. So I'll just say that cyber is another area where asymmetric capabilities have to be taken very seriously by a rising country like China. Then there's nuclear modernization. And I want to spend a second on this. I talked about the rudimentary nuclear deterrent of China in the past, and that was those liquid-fueled missiles with warheads that were not necessarily mated with the missiles. It would take a long time to launch them. This left Chinese strategists nervous about the ability of a country like the United States or the Soviet Union and its successor state, Russia, to eliminate the Chinese nuclear deterrent before it could be fired. So they modernized the nuclear deterrent in a certain way. They created solid-fueled, mobile, nuclear-tipped missiles. I say all those adjectives for a reason that I'll return to in a minute. They also have developed, and if public reports are accurate, can now field submarines that carry nuclear weapons. Submarines that can carry nuclear weapons, and I focus on that for a reason. So none of this is domination by China over the United States. This is not China taking over the world. And I don't believe it's a new Cold War with China, and we can talk about that. Some people in the United States believe it is a new Cold War with China. But it's not a new Cold War with China, in my opinion. But in some ways, I would say, it's more complicated in terms of coercive diplomacy for the United States and its allies. It's more complicated than the Cold War was, at least for the period from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the end of the Cold War. And the reason is that the Cold War was nasty. We shouldn't be nostalgic about it. We shouldn't look back on it with any kind of happiness. It was a nasty thing. I'm really glad the anti-communist forces, the anti-Soviet forces in the Cold War won. I think it's a hugely important thing for the world. But in some ways, the Cold War was relatively simple after the Cuban Missile Crisis in that both camps in the Cold War knew where the lines were between the camps, for the most part. There were exceptions, like a place like West Berlin, and it's not coincidental that those places had lots of crises. Right? But in general, you knew if the NATO forces went into the Warsaw Pact countries, that would be an offensive, very aggressive act. And if the Warsaw Pact went into the Western European NATO countries, that would be a very offensive and aggressive act. And we know from human psychology that this type of situation where there are clear boundary lines between potential adversaries, that this is a hugely stabilizing factor, particularly in a world with nuclear weapons, because we know from real social science, and there isn't that much real social science, that's really science, right? This is really science. This is psychology proven in laboratories by Nobel Prize winning psychologists, including my Princeton colleague Daniel Kahneman, that shows that people across ethnic groups, across gender, across age groups have something in common with rare exception. And that is that they will take bigger risks and pay higher costs to defend what they see as a legitimate status quo, what is legitimately theirs, than they will to get new things. Right? This has been proven. There are exceptions. Thank God they are exceptions, like Hitler. But they are rare. And the reason this is so important for what I'm saying today is that, unlike in the Cold War after the Cuban Missile Crisis, there is no accepted status quo in East Asia. That's why I spent the time I did describing those sovereignty disputes. It is my strong impression from talking to diplomats from all the disputing countries, including Japan, including the South China Sea dispute members, including all factions in Taiwan, none of whom want to become part of the PRC, that all of them believe that whatever position they take on sovereignty is legitimate. In other words, they're sincere, and that's what worries me most. I wish they were lying. I wish they were assertive. I wish they were revisionist. But they actually believe it. That's true for the Philippines. That's true for Malaysia. That's true for Vietnam, for sure. And it's true for China. They all have stories that say why their claims are legitimate. This is extremely dangerous because it means that one actor can be acting out of what that actor believes is a defensive motivation and therefore be willing to take lots of risks and pay very high costs. And the other actor can see that actor as aggressive and revisionist and needing to be stopped. And that's why I believe the East Asia coercive diplomatic environment is more complicated than it was in the Cold War after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay. So some people tell me that they think China is revisionist, it's trying to expand its map in the South China Sea. And I surprise them sometimes and I say, I wish. They say, why would you say you wish? Because if I believe that China didn't actually think its claims in the South China Sea were legitimate, I believe it would be easier to back China off of those claims. It would be easier to deter China from those claims. But I do believe they have a historical story about why those rocks, reefs, and islands are theirs, and they're sticking to it. In addition, there are escalation risks. I listed those military assets in detail for a reason. One of the great advantages that the United States has had, one of the great freedoms that the United States has had in the post-Cold War era, is that it was able to prevent its potential or actual adversaries from harming forward deployed U.S. forces in a conflict by taking very aggressive action against the capabilities of those states to hit forward deployed U.S. forces very early in a conflict. That's how the U.S. military has rolled in the post-Cold War era. In the Balkans, in Iraq, in Libya, anywhere it goes. And it's a very aggressive process. Right? The problem is that never before has the United States had to try to implement such a strategy against a large nuclear-capable state like the People's Republic of China. And worse still, China has put much of its conventional deterrent against forward deployed U.S. forces, those road mobile, solid-fueled, conventionally tipped missiles that I described, on the same, and those submarines, on the same spines as the nuclear deterrent. The road mobile, solid-fueled, modernized nuclear deterrent, and the submarines at sea. So if the United States were to go on a campaign against Chinese missiles to protect the forward deployed U.S. forces against conventional attack from missiles or submarines, it's quite possible the Chinese leadership would see this as an attack not just on the conventional forces, but also on their nuclear deterrent with real potential escalatory results. China does have a no first use policy on nuclear weapons, which could be a force for comfort and stability in this situation. But internal writings that we're not supposed to get, and I did not get in the US government, but got as an independent scholar, suggest that no first use in China is more of a guideline than a rule. In other words, they think about using nuclear deterrence and nuclear forces short of taking a nuclear attack first. So you can't take too much comfort in China's pledged no first use policy in this context if you're worried about escalation. The last problem is that all regional powers, including US allies like Japan and the Philippines, who are parts of these disputes, and even Taiwan, which is a security partner of the United States but not an ally, are hugely dependent on the Chinese economy for their own economic well-being, which gives China quite a bit of leverage with US allies, including South Korea, I would say, on this score. And that's an important factor as well. Finally, there's domestic politics. And my take on Chinese domestic politics and these security issues is a simple one. I'm willing to defend it. And that is that since the financial crisis of 2008, the Chinese government has a combination of reactions to that crisis, and that combination of reactions to that crisis is very detrimental to the US and allied efforts to maintain stability in Asia, and it goes something like this. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the Chinese government has been more confident about China's prospects abroad in East Asia and beyond because it feels like China's relative power has grown quickly in comparison to others. And the Chinese government has been less confident and more worried at home since the financial crisis of 2008. And since I'm a political scientist, we love 2x2 tables. And in this case, the cell that China has been in since 2008 is the worst cell in the 2x2 table. More confident abroad, more worried at home, because the worry at home can play itself out in nationalism, and it can play itself out in the need to react harshly to the actions of others in these disputes, and China isn't always the one that initially picks the fight. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But it feels a need to react in a way that doesn't make the government lose face. And in addition, there's this confidence that says these historical disputes have to end, and they have to end on our terms. We've claimed these things for a long time. Now we can do something about it. So that's a bad situation as well. And before I make you totally depressed about the sovereignty disputes, I will say one positive thing, which is there's a very positive feature which I believe has helped keep the peace. And I think it's important for Americans in particular to recognize that it has been a force for peace. And that is, there's something different about the 21st century East Asia than there was in great power competition and power transitions in the past. And that is a very deep degree of economic interdependence. Products aren't so much made in one country anymore, they're made in multiple countries. China is the endpoint for a transnational production chain that involves lots of different countries, including other disputants in these disputes. China has a huge disincentive to destabilize the region for this reason by prosecuting its claims violently or coercively. And I do believe that these factors have been very, very important in keeping the peace. It's not something you can prove because it's a counterfactual. But unfortunately, largely because of the behavior of the two largest powers, first China, and I want to emphasize that, first China, since the financial crisis, has adopted a series of economic strategies that have undercut the deepening of that transnational production chain and globalization. And more recently, the Trump administration has adopted unilateral tariffs that could do harm to that transnational production chain. So now you have the two biggest powers adopting policies that are challenging this factor, which is difficult to prove has been a force for peace. But I find it hard to believe that the disputes that I've described to you between Japan and China, between China and the Philippines, between China and Vietnam, would not have already become much more violent than they are if it wasn't for this factor. So I worry greatly that that factor could go away, but it won't go away overnight, and it's still there, and it's very, very deep. So it's a positive force for peace in the region. the fact that products are made with parts from multiple countries in a complex and very fragile transnational production chain. Okay, so that's the first challenge. And the second challenge, oh, well, let me say something about the U.S. response. As China grows its capability to get out into the region off of its coast, the United States has some really difficult choices to make, different types of challenges in different areas around these disputes. The one thing the United States, in my opinion, needs to do is to maintain a very strong military presence in East Asia. And it needs to maintain very strong relationships with its allies and security partners, which is America's greatest advantage over China in a competition. The United States has 60+ allies and security partners. China has North Korea, maybe Pakistan, maybe Zimbabwe, maybe Sudan, a kind of rogues gallery. And if the United States can maintain its security relationships, its alliances, it should be in a good position to compete. I worry somewhat about our management of our alliances in recent years, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. I think that the U.S. should strengthen the situational awareness, the ability of different countries in the region to see, and the military capabilities of some of the regional actors who actually have a dog in the fight over these sovereignty disputes when the United States really doesn't. And I think the U.S. can assist in that process of strengthening their capability to create an asymmetric challenge for forward deployed Chinese forces. But at the same time, and I think this is important, and I hear more and more voices in the United States arguing in a different direction, I think the United States needs to stay out of all of these sovereignty disputes, with the exception of the Senkaku dispute with Japan and the Diaoyu dispute from the Chinese perspective, which has traditionally been subject to the U.S.-Japan alliance because the United States gave those islands back to Japan in the early 1970s, administrative control of them. So the U.S. doesn't take any position on the sovereignty in that dispute, but does recognize Japanese administrative control because the United States gave it to Japan. Other than that, the United States takes no position on the sovereignty of Taiwan. It doesn't recognize it as part of China or not part of China. It takes no position on that. And it takes no position on any of the island disputes in the South China Sea, including the Filipino claims. It's an allied claim. It simply demands that the disputants solve the problems peacefully and in a way that's in accordance with international law. And I think that's a position the U.S. should maintain. I'm hearing lots of voices of people saying we should put Marines on features held by Malaysia or Vietnam or the Philippines, and it seems like A, science fiction, and B, really bad strategy to me. I think we need to stay out of that because it's unnecessarily provocative to the Chinese. The United States needs to continue to operate in the South China Sea in every area where international law allows. These things are called freedom of navigation operations in many instances. They're called FONOPs for short. These things are not particularly provocative military activities. They're some of the least dangerous military activities imaginable. They're simply an assertion that we can travel there and you can't stop us without wanting to fight us. The problem that's happened in the past during the Obama administration, in my opinion, is these relatively mild military activities were flaunted in the press as great muscular activity of the Obama administration to stand up to China, which is totally ridiculous from a military perspective and really bad diplomatically because you're poking China in the eye in public for no reason. You should just travel there. The Chinese will know you're there. They can see you. And if your allies need to know, you just tell them. We're traveling in that area. China's not keeping us out. We can still operate in the South China Sea and elsewhere in ways that are legal, and they're not going to stop us. So we should continue to do that. Okay, I promised that there was a second security challenge, and that is the need for the United States and its friends and allies to get cooperation from China on global security issues like non-proliferation. The problem here is that the world, as I said before, is more globalized and more interdependent than ever before in ways that are not similar to the world before World War I or any world we've seen before. And as such, all major economic actors need to contribute to pressure campaigns against target states that are endangering the international community. If a country the size of China does not contribute to such efforts, those efforts are likely to fail. If China obstructs those efforts, they're even more likely to fail. And China is by far the biggest economic partner, not just of North Korea, which most people know. It is by far the biggest economic partner of Iran. And that's going to become a big issue over the next year, in my opinion. China is not only the biggest purchaser of Iranian energy, it is also the biggest supplier of foreign consumables to Iran, and it's involved in the banking sector, infrastructure, etc. China's economy is big enough, even though it's still technically a developing country, per capita income nowhere near that of the United States. Its economy is big enough to provide support and succor to any state like Iran and North Korea, enough to survive an international campaign. So if we look at North Korea, China, I firmly believe, does not support North Korea's development of nuclear weapons. Now, if you have a different view of that, then you're not going to follow everything else I say. But I've dealt with the Chinese on this issue, and I don't believe they want North Korea to develop nuclear weapons. But they also don't want to see regime collapse in North Korea, for a range of reasons related to Chinese Communist Party legitimacy at home and its international strategy that I can talk about in the Q&A. China doesn't want the North Korean regime to go away, and it certainly doesn't want to participate in the destruction of the North Korean regime. China knows it has tremendous leverage over the North. Chinese diplomats will routinely say, we don't have that much control, we don't have that much influence. That's a very convenient out because China doesn't like its current situation, that it knows North Korea is totally dependent on China, and at the same time it's unhappy with North Korean behavior and doesn't want to take the steps to stop that behavior. So it's a very uncomfortable situation. It's a big burden on China. If you talk to Chinese elites, particularly off the record, they will complain about North Korea greatly. They don't like this burden. They would love to take the burden off their shoulders and give it to the United States. You take care of North Korea. You solve that problem. Just don't cause a war in the process and don't destroy the regime in North Korea. But you take care of it. Get it off our agenda. Right? So for the United States to get China to pressure North Korea, and I've seen this while I was in the government and I've seen it since, it has to do two opposite things, both of which are difficult for American presidents to do. And one of those things is to make the current status quo situation seem so dangerous to China that pressuring the North Korean regime seems more desirable than letting those trends continue in the same direction. And that's a difficult thing to do. The best way to do that, but it's dangerous, best in the sense of effective, is to make a credible threat of war on the Korean Peninsula if North Korea continues down its current path. Because China knows it doesn't want a war on the Korean Peninsula, which you know is up here, right, in its neighborhood. And it knows the result of such a war will be its outcome that it's trying to avoid, which is the destruction of the North Korean regime. So that's a double bad outcome for China. And it's something they worry about a lot. But short of war, the United States can suggest to the Chinese that if North Korea continues down its current path, the United States and Japan will do new activities in the military sphere that run against China's long-term security interests. The United States and South Korea will do things in the security sphere that will run against China's long-term national security interests. And worst yet, Japan and South Korea might start to do things together in ways that would challenge China's long-term security interests. One of the things China has prevented is a sort of NATO-type encircling alliance in its region, and the US has had a series of bilateral alliances. And China knows that it's unnatural for Japanese and South Koreans to cooperate in the security sphere because they don't like each other. Right? Let's put it simple. They don't like each other because of history, so it's very hard to accomplish. But on occasion, this actually happens. North Korea is so obnoxious that South Korea and Japan start to cooperate with each other. China notices in every instance of this. And it's my personal opinion that the reason China was so upset about the deployment of theater high-altitude air defense systems in South Korea, THAAD, was not because those systems looked into China, but because they would be linked to Japan in real time in a way that would create a kind of quasi-technical alliance, and that would be a very bad outcome for China. So the problem for the US on this score is it's very hard to credibly threaten the use of force on the Korean Peninsula because it's so dangerous. Not only do you have the 30,000 US military personnel in Korea, on any given day you have about 250,000 US citizens in Korea that would need to be evacuated. And unfortunately, the geography of the situation is South Korea has put the majority of its population and its most expensive assets in Seoul right up against the enemy. And that's where the Americans live too. Now there's also the South Korean allies. You have to worry about all the Koreans who would be killed. That would be very difficult. So it's very difficult to do that, and it's very difficult to sustain ROK Japanese cooperation. So that's a real challenge. So the United States needs to have that kind of credible threat to get China interested, but then it has to do something that's even harder for an American president to do at the same time, which is to assure China that if it pressures North Korea, the end game of that pressure campaign from the American perspective is not the destruction of the North Korean regime, but merely the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. In other words, if North Korea were to denuclearize, the United States has to credibly convey to the Chinese that the United States can live with the North Korean regime into the future if it doesn't have nuclear weapons. That's even harder for the United States to credibly convey. It is a bipartisan fetish of the United States to overthrow regimes we don't like. It's not just the George W. Bush administration that I served, right, in Iraq. The Obama administration, if anything, did it more frequently. In Ukraine, in Libya. What was the first Obama administration strategy in Syria when the civil war was escalating there? Assad has to go. Right? That's regime change. So the Chinese have difficulty believing that the United States would stop at denuclearization and not overthrow the regime. Now, well, I say all that because I think the Trump administration in the lead up to the June 2018 Singapore summit handled this situation extremely well. They were able to convey both of those opposite threats and assurances in a credible fashion because of the unusual nature of the top leader in the United States, arguably, in that he looked like he might actually go to war. And real security experts in late 2017, including myself, were very, very concerned about the prospect of war on the peninsula given the trend lines that we were heading on. And the US military was exercising very actively for such a war. The Chinese noticed this and were quite concerned. In addition, the Trump administration has had a studied, projected indifference to the lives of people outside the United States, right, as a kind of foreign policy ideology in a way that lent credibility to their frequent claims that they were not seeking regime change in North Korea. To the contrary, they were showing videos to the North Korean leadership about how great their country would be without nuclear weapons and how wonderful their situation would be, to the point where the president said he has a kind of love affair with the dictator of North Korea. This is something that most Americans couldn't imagine, right? But it's a certain characteristic. So they were able to convey those two things. We're not about regime change, and we are willing to go to war. And lo and behold, what did the Chinese do? Put the maximum pressure that they've ever put on North Korea in the lead up to the Singapore summit, without which I don't believe there would have been a Singapore summit. But the good news story ends there. Because I think at the Singapore summit, my own personal opinion, is the administration performed terribly. By declaring victory in a way that was self-congratulatory, saying we've solved this problem, let's move on to the next one, they removed all the pressure on China and allowed China to finally take that burden off its shoulders and give it back to the United States and say, okay, you guys work it out. And if the Trump administration's own claims are correct, and I'm sure they are because it fits logic, the Chinese reduced that pressure markedly as of Singapore to the present. Now there's not as much pressure on North Korea to denuclearize, to negotiate in good faith on denuclearization as there was before the summit. So I think that was a real tragedy because they built up that leverage, and I think they may have squandered it in that process. So I give them very high grades on the lead up to the Singapore summit, and I give them very low grades on the Singapore summit itself. I don't have time to talk about Iran in detail, but a lot of the same dynamics apply to Iran. If China doesn't cooperate with a pressure campaign on Iran, I would expect pressure on Iran to have very limited effect because of China's very large economic footprint in Iran. And I expect this to become a very big issue in US-China relations in 2019. There's a 6-month waiver right now on what the Americans call secondary sanctions. What are secondary sanctions? The sanctioning of third countries for having good relations with a country the United States doesn't like. The Chinese, with some good legal argumentation, believe that such sanctions are illegal. They don't like them. They think everything has to go through the UN Security Council. But the United States likes these things. It helped reach the first Iran deal in 2016. And it is a potent tool for the United States as the holder of the world's currency, et cetera. It has lots of ways to hurt banks, energy companies, et cetera, through these secondary sanctions. Now, China's gotten a 6-month waiver from the Trump administration. I don't expect that to last. And I think it's going to become a big issue in the US-China economic conflict in 2019 when the United States starts to sanction Chinese banks, energy firms, over their relationship with Iran. And it seems like the administration has a pretty open-ended strategy towards Iran to just hurt Iran as much as it possibly can without any kind of clear delineation of what Iran needs to do and not do to get out of that pain. So I expect that to last a long time. I expect it to be a major irritant in US-China relations. And I expect that to be on top of and an aggravation to the existing US-China trade war that's going on in 2018. So I've spoken for too long, and I would love to hear your questions. And I would love to be disabused of any form of pessimism that I have, and I would love to be bolstered in any form of optimism that I have. Please, thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions. You're all convinced? Yes, sir.
Thanks for a great talk. You started your talk with describing the buildup of the missile forces, especially the intermediate range, by China, lethality, accuracy, and quantity. That made me think of the INF treaty with Russia. What are your views on the abrogation of the INF treaty using the China angle as a justification?
Okay, so it's a 2-part question, so I'm going to break it down into pieces. I'll just show my own cards. I've been a long-term advocate of withdrawal from the INF treaty. Most immediately because Russia's been in systematic violation of it for quite a long time. It is basically a bilateral treaty between the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and the United States. It is actually a multilateral treaty now because a few of the Soviet successor states are signed on. It prevents not intermediate nuclear forces. It has a terrible name. It does not actually address nuclear forces per se. It is a ban on certain types of missiles. Because during the Cold War, it was considered easier to spot and count those missiles than it was to figure out what kind of warhead they had on them. So it bans land-based missiles with a range of 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers for Russia and the United States, for all intents and purposes. Russia has been in systematic violation of that for several years. We've complained to Russia about it. They've told us to go away, right? And what it does is it allows China this space to dominate those types of systems in East Asia without a response by the US. So I didn't understand the logic. I have a lot of colleagues who believe that arms control is like religion. You never violate it because it's part of the 10 Commandments of international relations. I think arms control is a tool. It could be a potentially stabilizing tool. It could be a potentially destabilizing tool. It's a tool, and it was a tool that was extremely useful. The INF Treaty was a very good treaty that the Reagan administration and Gorbachev signed for the time. It is now outdated. So I think it's a good idea that the US now has options in that realm to build conventionally tipped systems that could be based in Guam, or it could be mobile and based on US allies in the region. So I think that's a pretty definitive answer that I think, yes, we should get out of it. But whether it's all about China, if Russia had abided by its agreement, then you'd have a bigger cost for the United States to pull out. In other words, it would be the US saying, we're going to unilaterally violate this. We don't care about our commitments. And that has side costs that are eliminated in this case because Russia has violated it systematically for years. So, yes, sir.
Do you think, just as you described how President Trump has been somewhat unique in terms of his capacity to project attitudes that otherwise wouldn't be credible, do you think that's true with U.S. allies in the region as well? And do you think that his administration has potentially permanently changed our relationship with allies?
Permanent's a long time. No, but I do think that the downside of some of this bluster in 2017, I don't want to say it's bluster because I think they were serious. I really don't want to say it's bluster. I think they were very serious about getting ready for the use of force. But I think it scared allies a lot. Even Japan, which is probably the most hawkish on this issue of the U.S. regional allies, was nervous in late 2017 that there might be a war. The current North Korean missile ranges clearly range Japan. So, there's all this talk about them developing an ICBM. Do they have an ICBM? Would it work? Blah, 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 blah. But everybody thinks they have the ability to hit Japan. So Japan was ready to start a war, and we're going to be in the target zone. So they were nervous. South Korea was very nervous. I was in South Korea in December 2017. There was lots of nervousness there. So yeah, it has its impact, particularly in the case of South Korea now that you have a relatively, I don't know what adjective to use because every adjective you use is judgmental, but he's more accommodating to the North than his predecessors. Let's just say that. Right? He's more accommodating to the North than his predecessors. So to have a very hawkish policy while you have a leader like that in South Korea could have strains on the U.S.-ROK relationship. And I worry about the U.S.-ROK relationship moving forward because it seems like President Moon is a very energetic and ambitious force in the region now, that he's going to continue to push forward with this accommodation strategy. My guess is the Trump administration is going to become sick and tired of North Korean foot dragging and want to go back to pressure. That's going to lead to some friction. So yeah, there are costs for sure. And I think that, again, I'm not, I hope it comes across. I'm not trying to take sides. I'm an independent. I served in the Republican administration. I'm not a Republican. I was a White House appointee in a Republican administration, but I often say I'm a Groucho Marxist. I would never join a party that would have me as a member. So when I congratulate the Trump administration on that approach to Singapore, I think it was smart to want to talk to the North Korean leadership, and I think it was difficult to arrange, and I think they did a good job of getting there. And then I think, somewhat predictably, it didn't go very well. So, yes. It's a character flaw. No, it really is. I really believe that all these problems are solvable. Well, no, there's two things. I don't think China has demonstrated in its policies, in its doctrines, and the writings that they publish, and the writings that we get, even though we're not supposed to get, a systematic set of doctrinal strategies that suggest they want to drive the United States out of East Asia. That's just East Asia, right? In other words, destroy the US-Japan alliance, destroy the US-ROK alliance. I think they might be happy if that were to occur, but I think they know how dangerous it would be to try to do that, and therefore they're more moderate, and they're just saying we have to live with these alliances and we have to figure out how to counter them, make them less likely to come after us, but they haven't done that. In terms of global power projection and global dominance, I just simply don't think China has the capacity, nor will it have the capacity, to compete with the United States for decades to come. And one of the things I raise with people is, everything we talk about in terms of especially military affairs with China is right up against China. We talk about, well, how can we prevent China from dominating this area? How can we prevent China from dominating this area? How can we prevent China from forcing unification with Taiwan? All this stuff is right up against China. No one ever says, China will soon be able to take over Puerto Rico through amphibious assault, and the US military can't do anything about it. I mean, it would be laughable to even consider. But that's the equivalent of what the United States is doing by projecting power that far away from the United States and trying to help its friends and allies far away from home, something I support. I'm not criticizing it as imperialism or anything. I'm just saying it's very difficult to project power that far from your home base against a determined and increasingly powerful adversary, even though that adversary is not a peer competitor. So I wrote an article in 2001 called Posing Problems Without Catching Up to try to get away from this debate in the United States about just how many decades it would take China to catch up. And I said China can already spoil our whole day, and that's only going to get worse over the next 2 decades. And unfortunately, I was right. I just don't see them. In economics, in diplomacy, 60-plus US allies and security partners. China's got very few. And in economics, I don't see them anywhere near the United States in terms of economic power. And in military affairs, they can't project power very far out of their region and not be at severe risk to relatively weak militaries, let alone the US military.
Where I was going with my question was, Xi Jinping has talked about by 2050, China being a global leader in terms of its composite national strength. So I was wondering if...
Yeah. I liked your translation, a global leader, because that's how I translate it, not the global leader. Some people translate it as they want to be the global hegemon. Well, good luck with that. Right? It's hard to be the global hegemon. It's tough being an American national security tech. But yeah, I think they'll be a lot stronger in 2050 if trend lines continue. It's a big if. There's a lot of challenges for China. So will they be, they in a sense already are a great power in that we can't solve any major significant problem around the world, as I suggested, without Chinese cooperation. So even if China has a per capita GNP in 2012, in my book I had it $9,000 a head, the US was $56,000 a head. So that's real economic power as per capita GNP because that's disposable income. But it's got so many people that it's a big economic footprint that you can't ignore. So will China be a major economic and political player in 2050? Yes. So Xi Jinping is almost certain to be right, unless it has a catastrophic collapse. And I'm still of the opinion that a catastrophic collapse in China would be a catastrophe not just for China, but for the United States. There's no office in the State Department for catastrophic collapse in China. There's no office in the Pentagon for catastrophic collapse of China. Think about the implications. It would be mind-blowing. It would make Syrian refugee crises look like, a picnic. Proliferation. So people should be careful what they wish for when Americans say, we should undermine the Chinese system and destabilize it. We should promote reform because that's the right thing to do, and it's also the smart thing to do for everyone, including the Chinese. But we shouldn't be undermining stability in China in a radical way because it's dangerous. Jing.
I keep thinking about the point you made at the beginning, much as Dan did, that China does not have the intention of keeping the U.S. out of East Asia, but certainly South China Sea, right? Would you talk a little bit about the Blue Water Navy and the recent military buildup that we're witnessing now, also the complete overhaul of American defense strategy, and also China's To build up these, aircraft carriers, so on and so forth.
Okay, that's a lot of different things. So China is now able to project power out into the South China Sea. It gets more and more tenuous as it gets further and further from home for the Chinese. One of the most important aspects of military power projection is always logistics, the ability to get water and food and ammunition to your forces far from home. The US military has become really expert at this over a long period of time. The Chinese military is just learning how to do it. So it has a lot of power projection in this area. It has less. And remember, their claims go all the way down to here. So what China has done, because the neighbors are relatively weak, it has not only used its what's called gray hull navy, it has used Coast Guard ships, what are called white hulls, and something that the Chinese have invented, the maritime militia, which are basically fishermen with guns who answer to the government. And they travel to these areas to assert Chinese presence in ways that are very annoying to relatively weak navies like the Malaysian Navy or the Filipino Navy that aren't very annoying to the US Navy. In addition, they've built these artificial islands in the South China Sea and the Spratly Islands, the disputed Spratly Islands, in a way that I'll admit, was surprising to me. The scope and speed with which they did it was surprising to me. And I assumed right away that they would be militarized. President Xi promised that President Obama that he had no intention of doing that. Of course, I didn't believe him at the time, and he has gone ahead and militarized them. That's a real challenge, particularly for the other disputants in the region. It's not a particular challenge to the US military in a fight. If there was an open fight between the US military and the Chinese military, those islands would be a very bad place to be. Being in a fixed area in the 21st century with military equipment, out in the open, with no place to run, really, really bad. Right? So, but if you're a Filipino, you have to take those things extremely seriously. And it does provide them certain capabilities, which means you have to take them out. They pose a threat. If you have to take them out, you have to escalate. So it does provide that coercive leverage. And it's a problem. But I don't believe that China is going to be able to exclude the US military from the South China Sea in the near future. And that's really what the whole dispute is about from an American perspective. It's not about freedom of navigation for shipping. So when people testify to the Congress, they say $5 trillion to $7 trillion of goods, no one really knows how much, a lot, go through the South China Sea. It's the busiest trading route in the world. So it's really good show for a congressional testimony to say, oh, we have to protect the global commons and keep the trade flowing through China's never going to cut off trade through the South China Sea. Most of that trade goes to China. Why would they cut it off? Right? So what's the real issue? It's freedom of navigation for the US military. The US military has a network of alliances around the world. It projects power through this region into the Middle East. The US has basing rights in Singapore. When we fought in distant Afghanistan, some of the earliest bombing runs we know from public reports. I have to speak like that because I do government work. Public reports that some of those bombing runs came from Singapore to Afghanistan. This is how the US projects power around the world. If those links are cut by an actor like China, it would have severe implications for US alliances, so the US needs to operate there. I don't think China can prevent the United States from operating in the South China Sea, and if it tried to, it would have to open fire on the US military, which is a degree of Chinese aggression that I don't expect to see. But when we do operate there, we shouldn't be poking the Chinese government in the eye in public because it's pointless. It only gets their backs up. It only puts their face on the table in front of their own public. Just operate there. If they object, we object. If they don't object, we just make the blanket statement that we, the United States, operate wherever international law allows, and we will continue to do so, and no one will stop us. And it's not a good bet to take on the US Navy to this day. It's not as strong as it was compared to China in this region, but it's not a good bet. It wouldn't end well. The Japanese Navy is pretty formidable. I wish the Filipino Navy was more formidable. I sometimes worry that our allies want to fight to the last American.
Thank you for your presentation. the so-called personal relationship between Trump and Xi and the fact that when they get together, will they actually be able to not necessarily solve, but diminish the problems that currently exist, including intellectual property?
Okay, I don't know how close they are. I don't know how to gauge the closeness of their relationship. I think any country dealing with the United States right now would want to build the impression, if not the reality, that the top leader in that country gets along personally with our president, because he seems like a very personalistic president. So that's something China's conveying, that President Xi and President Trump have this relationship. President Trump constantly praises President Xi. And maybe that's his diplomatic strategy, realizing that President Xi has built up this kind of cult of personality around himself in China that hasn't existed for a very long time. So if he's that kind of leader, then you want to brush him up and say what a great leader he is and how wonderful he is. So maybe that's the mutual thing. But I don't know how close their relationship actually is. And I don't put a lot of stock in that for solving the problems. But it is one ray of hope in a pretty dismal environment. And again, I do think that the trade disputes started with the financial crisis. China changed a lot of its economic trajectory after the financial crisis in ways that ran against long-term trends that were very beneficial for China and very beneficial for the region of sort of positive sum economic relations with its neighbors. And that has aggravated lots of countries, the United States and during the Obama administration. It has aggravated the EU. It has aggravated Japan and South Korea. And then in more recent years, the United States has moved away from its long-term commitments to multilateral institutions in ways that has aggravated lots of people, including China. So now we're in a very dark place. If the answer to this problem is the very good personal relationship and a wonderful piece of chocolate cake between President Xi and President Trump, good on them. Who am I to say? I'm not the president. It's way above my pay grade. But what concerns me is that the Trump administration has used the threat of tariffs or the willingness to scrap previous agreements in ways that have allowed them to gain leverage with other actors in order to deepen the economic integration between the United States and those actors. That's how I would code the relationship with Canada and with Mexico. In other words, a lot of it was leverage. Now, I don't think the NAFTA was the worst deal ever. I actually think it was a good deal. And I don't think the current deal is worlds better than NAFTA, but it's better than NAFTA from an American perspective. It's somewhat better. And it was created through that leverage, that threat of tariffs. So that can be done that way. And I think that that was at least the goal of some of his advisors. I think my sense is, I don't know because I don't know, your excellent question might trump, pun intended, all of these factors that I'm about to list. But I don't think that that's true for China. I think there's a domestic ideology about China and trade with China that is bipartisan. It is held more strongly in the Democratic Party than in the Trump administration. But there's this idea that China's been cheating us and they need to be punished. And we need to decouple to some degree from the Chinese economy. And I think that there is, on top of that ideology, an ideology I don't fully agree with. I hope I'm suggesting, but it's very real. I mean, if anybody was the most protectionist in the 2016 campaign was Bernie Sanders by a lot. Second was Trump, and third was Hillary Clinton, who said she would pull out of TPP. My hope was that if she were elected, that she was just lying again. So I think she might have actually stayed in TPP somehow. But pulling out of TPP was bad. So I just think with China, in addition to the ideological issue, is the national security one, which is that the notion that the integration between the US and Chinese economies has led to some of this military modernization that I described and accelerated that military modernization. So that's a winning hand in a domestic dispute because there are certain advisors of the president who really don't like the US-China economic relationship writ large. So normally, in this kind of economic dispute that we have with China, the solution of most administrations from either party would be to try to remove the obstacles that you see. I think the Trump administration's complaints about the Chinese economy are legitimate. In other words, they have moved from 2008 to the present in a more statist direction, away from the trends up to 2008. They have forced foreign companies to give up intellectual property as a precondition for access to the market. Right? They have stolen intellectual property through systematic efforts. So all of that was true. Even when I was in the government, some of that was true, back before the financial crisis. But it's gotten much worse. All those things are real. But then the question is, what do you do about it? Are you trying to remove those obstacles and create greater integration? Or are you trying to just punish China and decouple? And if you're trying to remove them, what you do is do things like bilateral investment treaties, multilateral investment treaties, to try to remove those preconditions for economic integration. I think that's true for the Trump administration in Canada. I think it's true in Mexico. My sense is it's not true for China.
So, a quick follow-up. Do you feel at all sanguine or confident that there will be some kind of progress?
No. I'm not sanguine. I'm not confident. But if there is progress, it'll be for the reason you cited. I thought it was an excellent question. It will be because Tom Christensen doesn't have a clue what's in the head of the President of the United States or in the head of the President of China and their relationship, and maybe they can just solve this problem. But if they do, some of President Trump's advisors will be kicking and screaming because they won't like the result. The result would be what most presidents in the United States would want, which is to remove the obstacles, remove the theft, protect IPR, integrate the economies more along the lines that they were doing from 1978 to 2008. But some of his advisors, people like Peter Navarro, I would think wouldn't be happy with that result, right? So I don't know, but I think that if there is a solution to the current trends we're on, and I'm pessimistic that there are, it will be along these lines. That the top leadership will say, get my advisors out of the room, we're going to cut a deal. It's possible. Yes, sir.
I have two questions. One is about nuclear weapons in North Korea, and the other one is the terminal high altitude.
Just when I was getting cheered up.
So there's general consensus that there's no way that North Korea will give up nuclear weapons.
I don't
think
agree.
they have this capacity to produce like a dozen each year. Is there any possibility that we recognize North Korea as a nuclear power and then negotiate with the country? That's the first question. My second question is,
That's a big one.
you mentioned that China is not concerned about its security as a result of the installation of the terminal high altitude defense system, but more concerned about the collaboration between Korea and Japan.
In the U.S.
Could you elaborate a little bit about
I can't really elaborate more about it, but let me just say, what I can say about it is I have a student who's a Navy officer who worked on missile defense in the past, who's published about it in the Naval War College Review. And his name is Robert Watts, and I would recommend that you read his article. I agree with his thesis. I agreed with his thesis before he wrote it. I agree with his thesis now. I can't elaborate on the technical side of it because most of that stuff would be out of the realm of public discussion. But missile defense is very complicated. It requires a lot of situational awareness and a lot of linkages. And it seems natural that Chinese security analysts, and they've written about it, are concerned about the implications of such sophisticated missile defenses in the hands of any of the regional actors if they wanted to keep those regional actors from not being linked to a global U.S. network. And Japan's linked to that global U.S. network. So I'll just leave it at that. I really can't go into more detail. I apologize. There are limits to what I can discuss. The question of North Korean denuclearization, I never give up hope on these things. I think you have to continue to push for North Korean denuclearization. My boss, Chris Hill, in the six-party talks one time said something that stuck with me and I agree with, which is North Korea with nuclear weapons, I would rather see a toddler with a hand grenade. It's just not a good state to have nuclear weapons. So is it impossible? No, I don't believe it's impossible. I believe that it's become a kind of truism that it's impossible for them to give up nuclear weapons because they believe it is their security blanket, their last type of security, right? Well, there's another security blanket that they have, which is China. Without China, they don't have security, their regime or anything else, and they know it. So I still believe that if China were willing to put on persistent and heavy-duty pressure on North Korea, that they would have little choice but to negotiate. Now, whether they would negotiate in good faith or not is another matter. And I think they did negotiate in June 2018 because China put pressure on them. They negotiated in February 2007, I outline it in my book, because China put pressure on them. They notice when China puts pressure on them. And if you ask a Chinese diplomat, I guarantee the Chinese diplomat will say, oh, America exaggerates our control over North Korea. It's not a question of control. It's a question of reminding them what's keeping them alive. Right? So if it became totally intolerable to China. Now, could you just recognize North Korea as a nuclear state, a legitimate nuclear state, and then negotiate? Why? I don't understand why. I mean, they violated their NPT agreement. They pulled out of the NPT. And nobody believes they should have them. If you recognize North Korea as a legitimate nuclear state and then negotiate, I don't know if you gain any negotiating leverage, because it looks more acceptable for them to have them. And I think in addition, you significantly raise the likelihood that South Korea will go nuclear. And I believe that Japan will eventually go nuclear. I know that Japan has allergies to nuclear weapons, and I take them seriously, but people get over allergies, right? There are pills for that. And I don't think that's a good outcome for anyone. Is Japan really going to be the only country in East Asia forever that doesn't have nuclear weapons? So I think it's in China's interest to get these weapons out of there, right? The question is, what price are they willing to pay, and how many risks are they willing to take? And again, you know, I gave the Trump administration high marks. It's not easy as an academic to give the Trump administration high marks in the spring of 2018 to get North Korea to the table, and their willingness to talk, which I always think is a good idea. People say, oh, your engagement strategy with China was a failure. Stop engaging. That's just idiocy. We had an embassy in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. You engage, right, when you can. Now, I don't think we should recognize North Korea and have diplomatic relations without some progress on this. But you get my drift, which is, you know, it doesn't help to just isolate. Yes, ma'am. Can you speak louder?
Yeah, sorry. You mentioned that China is on the defense, at least when it comes to claims in the South China Sea. But then on the other hand, there's also clear military and economic expansion when it comes to BRI, literally building islands. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit on in which sectors China is on the defense and in which sectors they're looking to expand and why.
I think China has been very assertive and destabilizingly assertive in the South China Sea. So I want to make that statement up front. And I think the building of the islands was very retrograde behavior by China. Now, to Chinese defense, just as a side note, is that China was the last country in the dispute to build artificial islands in the South China Sea. It's just that when China does stuff, it really does stuff. Right? It's a big, you know, these are giant, you know, coral-killing enterprises, right? And they build much bigger assets on those islands. So when I say they think they're defensive, what I'm saying is China believes it's securing long-held claims that they believe are justifiably Chinese from history. I think that's true in the East China Sea. I don't know a single Japanese who doesn't believe the Senkakus are Japanese. I don't know that many Chinese who don't believe the Diaoyu Islands should have been returned to China in the Cairo Declaration of 1943, and therefore are being illegally occupied by Japan. No, it's not occupied. That's the great thing about the Senkakus and why I'm optimistic. South China Sea, not that many people down there. People are the ones who cause trouble. So they're just rocks and reefs and stuff. Senkaku Islands, no one lives there. They're just goats on the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, just goats. And you know, I actually do these like gaming exercises sometimes. And before I had clearances, I used to do them. And you know, one time they said, you are the Chinese leader. You have special forces on one of the Diaoyu Islands to start the game. What's your first move? I said, I get my special forces off of that island. They weren't happy with that. Because it's crazy to try to occupy these sharp rocks. Because then how do you get water to people? You know, they're so easy to attack them. It's not good to be in a fixed position at sea. Right? So all that said, I think China has been very assertive, destabilizing in the South China Sea by being as assertive as it has been vis-a-vis the other disputants. But the problem is that I do believe at the same time that they believe that sacrificing their claims there would be the loss of something that they're committed to defend because they have made those claims for so long. And I think that's true of the Philippines. I think that's true of Malaysia. I think that's true of Vietnam, for sure, for Vietnam. And that worries me. All these people believe they're in the right. And when people believe they're in the right, they tend to be tougher. Right? So this is a bigger challenge for the United States. Fortunately, the United States doesn't have any claims. And when it does the freedom of navigation operations, it's just saying, we can sail and fly here. You can't stop us. It's legal. That's all the United States is saying. It's not saying we're siding with Malaysia over some shoal against China. And I hope that stays that way. There's no need for the United States to do that. It would be very provocative for the United States to do that. And it's entirely unnecessary for the United States to do that. But I hear more and more voices in Washington saying we need to take a tougher stand. And it usually takes the form of, the Obama administration was too weak. Usually the sentence starts with, the Obama administration was too weak, we need to be stronger. And I'm like, well, what did the Obama administration do or not do that you object to? Well, they didn't stop the Chinese from building the artificial islands. And they said, well, how were they supposed to stop them from doing that? Should they have used the US Navy to shoot dredging ships from China? Usually silence after that question. Right? Well, they didn't see it coming. I said, I kind of think they did. Dredging ships are big. There are satellites. Right? I don't have to disclose secrets to say I think they saw it coming. Right? Maybe in a political sense, they didn't know in 2013 that China was going to go on this binge, but I think they saw it happen. Very difficult to stop, right? Unless you want to take sides and say, no, you're invading the Philippines claim. And so the ruling in 2016 was very useful. It was a sweeping victory for the Philippines. It was a sweeping condemnation of the Chinese position. I think that's the basis on which the US can operate and other actors can operate. Just to say, China's never clarified what this means in international law, and they're very reluctant to do so. It's one of the things the United States has insisted that China do. Because it would be illegal to say all of that water inside that red line is Chinese territorial water. That's ridiculous, impossible under international law. Now, they could say that all of the rocks and reefs and things that stick out of the ocean are Chinese and that they have certain international rights. But the International Tribunal has said there are no islands in the southern part of the South China Sea, in the Spratly area. So therefore, there are no exclusive economic zones cast from those features. Right. So China's claims, even if they got all the spots, would be relatively limited, and the 9-dash line would be largely meaningless. So the courts have said the 9-dash line itself is not consistent with international law in any meaningful way. And certain activities and actions by China in the 9-dash line have been illegal, and one of them is the building of a structure at Mischief Reef in the 1990s on top of what's called a low tide elevation. And they built a military structure on that low tide elevation in the Philippines EEZ, cast from its main islands, which is indisputable EEZ. The problem is that a low tide elevation is not sovereign territory. Low tide elevation is something that is not above water 24 hours a day. When it's high tide, it's submerged. So that doesn't count in international law for either territorial seas or economic zones. And you can't just build on top of a low tide elevation in someone's exclusive economic zone without permission, and China never got that permission. So that's illegal. We know that one's illegal. That's one of the freedom of navigation operations the US has conducted recently, is really close to that, saying, you got nothing. And China freaks out, and it says things that are legally ambiguous, like, you are threatening our sovereignty. What does that mean? Are we violating it or are we threatening it? If you're violating it, that's a claim. That'd be a clarifying claim. If you're threatening it, I don't know what that means. So, yes, China has been assertive. I don't want to dismiss all of that. I'm very concerned about Chinese behavior. But I would be more concerned if I thought, I'd be less concerned if I thought China was doing something outside of its long-term claims. Because I think we'd be able to back them down. If China started to suggest that it was going to move on Okinawa, I would find that concerning, but I think we could stop it. Because it wasn't part of the map. Right. Yes.
Could you just briefly comment on the trend of China acquiring ports just around the country, and if the...
Around which country?
Well,
around the world.
Around the world, around the Middle East, Gwadar, and
Okay.
Pakistan and so forth.
Oh, yeah, let's go back.
The ability to
Love that.
militarize those ports, how real of a threat is that, and how much do you kind of worry about that?
Okay, so China has invested in ports around the world. It has had some political implications of those port purchases. So one of them was in Greece. Oops, that was not the proper button. There's the proper button. So up in Greece, Piraeus, it has 99-year rights. This might sound familiar to those who know Chinese history. 99-year lease rights to a port in Sri Lanka. So it's China's own Hong Kong. And it has invested in ports throughout Europe, fairly large holdings. So a lot of people have made a lot of fuss about this trend. The port you mentioned before, Gwadar, where is Gwadar? It's here. It's important because it will build it could potentially build a path into China that avoids this alleged Malacca dilemma, this ability of China to be cut off from the Strait of Malacca. The Malacca dilemma, I believe, is a large fabrication of various forces in China that benefit from the story of the Malacca dilemma, including construction companies who work out here, people who build pipelines through Burma, and the Chinese Navy, all of whom benefit greatly from the story that the United States is going to shut off the Straits of Malacca and keep things from flowing into East Asia, which would also damage our allies. And anyway, but that's a side story. So is it important? Yes, it's important in that it gives China influence in these regions. In the case of Greece, Greece is a member of the European Union. The European Union wanted to raise a human rights complaint against China, which has dismal human rights and worsening human rights conditions, particularly under Xi Jinping. And lo and behold, China had this investment in Piraeus, and Greece blocked the EU from making the. So that's the kind of influence that China's gotten. It's not how it's often portrayed in the US media. I don't think it's China trying to systematically undermine democracy around the world. It's China systematically trying to prevent the rest of the world from criticizing Chinese Communist Party rule at home, which is a much more limited operation. It's a much more achievable operation. And I think it's a different type of operation than the systematic targeting of democracy, which I do think the Russians have done quite a bit of, right? Which is a different bag of beans. Is it important? The general story is that this will provide power projection for the Chinese. There's also Djibouti, right? There's Gwadar. There's where's Sri Lanka. That this will provide the power projection for China around the world. It's going to take a long time at a minimum for China to have the Navy that could exploit those assets. People point out that there is a Chinese Navy flotilla off the coast of Africa, but that is a counter-piracy operation. It's very limited in its military fighting capacity. To build the kind of Navy that could use those ports in a kind of US-style way is many decades away, right? At least a few, right? At least a few. In addition, having port rights in a sovereign country does not give you control of the ports. Lots of US ports are run by foreign companies. I learned this stuff. It's stuff they force you to learn as a China specialist. So lots of US ports in California and elsewhere are run by foreign companies because they're good at it. It doesn't mean that in a war the United States couldn't get those people out of there. It doesn't mean that the US Coast Guard doesn't have sovereign policing rights in those ports. So that's true even for Sri Lanka, weak Sri Lanka. So I worry a little bit less about it until I see more evidence. But it's something to watch. Fortunately, it's easy to watch. And it's slow moving. So we should keep an eye on it. But I don't lose a lot of sleep over it yet. It is something to consider. The whole One Belt, One Road initiative, which is really interesting, I think has been greatly exaggerated in its importance to date. My strong sense of it is having studied the 1950s in China, Peter mentioned my book, my first book, is that this is largely a political campaign at this point. The great leader has said everybody needs to be involved in One Belt, One Road. So everybody, lo and behold, is involved in One Belt, One Road. So no matter what you want to do internationally, you've got to link it to One Belt, One Road. And I'm not convinced that there is a great grand blueprint in anybody's head about where this is all heading? And if there is, I'm not convinced that the actual activity of Chinese entities has fit that grand blueprint. And a very good report from CSIS on the One Belt, One Road, which says, let's imagine there's a grand strategy here and that it fits what President Xi has been saying. Where would you expect the activity to take place? In which countries and in which areas of those countries? And he kind of tracks the geography, and lo and behold, it doesn't seem to be following it. And I talked to one professor who said, yeah, you have to be part of One Belt, One Road. We wanted to hire some guy who knows something about Central Asia just because he's a good scholar. So we just said, it's part of our One Belt, One Road initiative. And lo and behold, he got funding for the hire. So this is what political movements in communist countries are like. Let me take, is there a woman who wants to ask a question? Guys tend to, it's a tendency in every place I go. If a woman, okay, so this will be the last one, but I wanted to make sure, because, it's always guys.
Thank you for, so this is more of an intellectual exercise, more less
You might
practical,
stump me then.
But why do you think is China more inward looking or more interested in more interested in holding on to its own territory or holding on to its historical claims and expanding overseas or projecting strength overseas? You mentioned that Russia seems to be interested in sort of toppling democracies or undermining democracies overseas, but why is China not doing this? I'm just curious, is China not at the stage of economic development yet, or is it just a particular function of the specific leaders?
It's a great question. I have to preface my answer with saying I'm not a Russia expert, right? So I don't know what makes Putin tick. I do think that the reason that China is focused on its current territorial claims is in part because they're near China, and that's where China has the capacity to project power. Now, that could change over time. So if those ports became real naval bases and China had a real blue water navy with all the logistics supplies, all the bells and whistles, it could project power into the Indian Ocean in a significant way for a significant period of time, I would be concerned and be watching that. But it's also part of the nationalist story of China and the CCP's domestic legitimacy that it was going to rectify the unequal treatment of China in history, going back to the Opium War. Chiang Kai-shek also had that ideology as part of his legitimacy in the KMT regime, the Republic of China. So there's a domestic reason to emphasize the historical claims as well. Why does Russia do what it's doing? In part, Russia is much more of a, like the current leadership in Russia, as I understand it, is much more of a kind of wounded recent victim than China, in the sense that they lost their Soviet empire relatively recently. And they feel like a lot of it was negotiated away either unfairly or by their immediate leader in the post-Soviet era who was a drunk. And there's no doubt, I mean, Yeltsin was drunk all the time. 24 hours a day he was drunk. It's hard to imagine, right? A great power, a leader like that, but he was drunk all the time. So for Putin's perspective, things like Crimea were simply given away, right? Back in the days, Putin was critical of Khrushchev for giving Crimea into Ukraine as part of the Soviet Union, right, which is the initial sin. But back then, nobody imagined Ukraine would ever be independent, so it didn't matter that much, right? But then once it's independent, why don't you get it back? Well, the argument is, and I don't know if it's true, but the argument is because Yeltsin was drunk, right? So they have stuff to get back. They have irredentism, right? The question is how much does that expand? Does that mean all the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, have to become part of Russia again? That's really scary. Those are NATO allies. That would be trouble. And then I think that Putin is much more aggressive in a kind of Soviet way about interference in the internal affairs of other states and his desire to discredit Western European democracy and the EU because he sees that as part of the NATO expansion that's coming at him. I don't think China has that same set of concerns. And the Chinese Communist Party, I don't see them as revisionist. I don't think they're trying to overturn the international order as we know it. They're routinely called revisionist. I actually think they're quite conservative. I think the United States has long been revisionist in a way that I support. The United States has tried to promote democracy around the world where there is no democracy. This is something I support, right? But that's revisionist. I think the Chinese Communist Party is about one simple thing in the post-Mao era. When Mao was in power, they interfered in everybody's internal affairs. So never believe a Chinese expert or diplomat who says, China never interferes in the internal affairs of other states. Mao did it every day in every way. But since Deng Xiaoping took over, the Chinese Communist Party has been all about the Chinese Communist Party. All three words, right? That it has to be Chinese, it's about China, it's about domestic, it's about one-party rule, and it's about a communist party rule in the 21st century, which is simply bizarre. Right? It's the 21st century. I just went to Prague. I just returned from Prague 2 days ago. I went to the Communism Museum. It's weird that China has a communist party. Just if you take a step back, there aren't that many left. It's kind of embarrassing. It should be kind of embarrassing, right? They have a communist party. Right? It should be kind of embarrassing. It's the 21st century. Right? But they have one, and so does North Korea, and so does Cuba. And they're sticking to it. And they're trying to make the world safe for authoritarianism in the sense that they want to have the world not be so critical of Chinese Communist Party rule at home that it's somehow destabilizing. So they criticize color revolutions abroad, promoted by the United States. They criticize any criticism of China's domestic rule. And they criticize things like China's severe recent repression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. That's going to really become a big issue. This isn't something the rest of the world is going to just turn a blind eye to, particularly the Islamic world. So I think this is going to become a major aggravant in China's foreign policy, and we'll see how it plays out. But I think what China will do in each of those instances is try to muffle criticism of China on that score, not try to create authoritarianism as opposed to democracy in the country that's criticizing China on that score, which is a very different set of goals. It's a great question. I hope the answer is somewhat satisfactory. I think it's a little bit too complicated, and I think you'd have to be both an expert on Russia and China to answer it more fully. But I do see them as different. They are lumped together in the national security strategy of the United States. China and Russia are revisionist states. I don't think they should be lumped together. They're both challenges, but they're different types of challenges, at least to date. Thank you, thank you, thank you.